The night of June 22nd, 2026. Somewhere in the dark sky above occupied Crimea, a Ukrainian drone was on its final approach. Below it, a railway bridge stretched across the North Crimean Canal near the village of Rozdolne, a bridge that had quietly served as one of the most important military arteries in Russia's entire southern theater of war. The drone hit. The bridge span collapsed into the water, and Ukraine's Special Operations Forces issued a statement that rippled through military capitals around the world. The bridge, they said, no longer exists. That was not a figure of speech. Satellite imagery confirmed the structural collapse. Railway traffic on the only rail line connecting Russia's Krasnodar region with central and western Crimea came to a complete halt. And that single strike, as devastating as it was not the beginning of this story. It was the moment the story reached its tipping point. What has been unfolding across occupied southern Ukraine and Crimea since the spring of 2026 is one of the most significant shifts in the logistics of this entire war. Ukraine has not broken through Russian defensive lines with a major armored assault. Instead, it has done something more methodical, more surgical, and potentially far more damaging over time. Launched a systematic campaign to cut Russia's military off from its own supplies. And by the summer of 2026, according to commanders on the ground and independent military analysts, it is working in ways that are impossible to dismiss. To understand why this matters so much, and why Moscow now finds itself in genuine strategic difficulty, you need to understand exactly how Russia supplies its forces in Crimea and across the occupied south. There are essentially three routes. The first is the Kerch Bridge, spanning 19 kilometers across the Kerch Strait, connecting Crimea directly to the Russian mainland. It was Vladimir Putin's personal prestige project, opened in 2018 and inaugurated with Putin himself driving across it in a construction truck. Its completion was presented to Russian domestic audiences as the physical proof that Crimea's integration into Russia was permanent and irreversible. The second route is maritime, ships, tankers, and ferries crossing the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And the third, which Russia spent years and billions of dollars developing as a backup, is the so-called land corridor, a web of roads and railways running from Russia's Rostov region through Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol before entering northern Crimea. For most of the war, Russia believed this three-route system made its logistics genuinely resilient. If one route came under attack, another could absorb the load. Reuters reported in March 2026 that Moscow had allocated roughly $8 billion between 2024 and 2026, specifically toward roads, railways, ports, and industrial projects across occupied southern Ukraine, including what became known as the Azov Ring Highway Network, designed to link Crimea to occupied Donbass in southern Russia via multiple redundant corridors. The Kremlin, in other words, had invested enormous resources to ensure there was no single point of failure in its southern supply chain. The thinking was straightforward: diversify the routes, and no single Ukrainian strike could cripple the system. Before examining what happened next, it is worth spending a moment on Crimea's supply geography, because understanding the physical reality of the peninsula explains why Russia's logistics problem is so structurally difficult to solve. Crimea is essentially an island connected to the Russian mainland only by the Kerch Strait and the narrow land bridge through occupied Kherson and Zaporizhzhia oblasts. The peninsula has a land area of roughly 27,000 square kilometers and a population of approximately 4 million people. To supply a military garrison of the scale Russia has stationed there, plus the combat forces using Crimea as a staging and resupply base for operations across southern Ukraine, requires a continuous, high-volume flow of ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, and personnel. Military analysts have estimated that Russian forces in southern Ukraine alone require hundreds of supply trucks per day under normal combat operations. That is, before you factor in the garrison forces on the peninsula itself, the air defense systems that require constant maintenance and missile resupply, and the Black Sea Fleet installations at Sevastopol. Crimea is not simply a piece of occupied territory. It is an enormous logistical consumer sitting at the end of supply chains that Ukraine has now put under comprehensive, simultaneous attack. And the physical geography works against Russia in another way. Unlike the vast, multi-route logistics networks that Russia uses to supply forces in Donetsk and Luhansk, where there are many roads, many railways, and much of the territory borders Russia directly, Crimea's connections to the Russian rear are inherently choke points. There are limited bridges, there are limited crossing points. The land corridor runs through a narrow coastal strip. The Kerch Strait is only 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. This geography, which Russia believed it had solved through the Kerch Bridge and the Azov Ring highway investments, turns out to be a vulnerability that drone warfare has exposed rather than eliminated. Those certainties did not survive contact with what came next. In the spring of 2026, a new phase of the conflict quietly began. Ukraine's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, announced a UAH-5 billion program, equivalent to roughly $111 million, specifically designed to fund a mass-scale campaign of medium-range drone strikes against Russian logistics infrastructure between 20 and 200 kilometers behind the front line. He called it, without ambiguity, a logistics lockdown. The funding was channeled to the most effective frontline units through an electronic points reward system, with money going to the units producing the most verifiable results. The Guardian and Kyiv Post both reported the program's details in late May 2026. And within weeks, the effects were visible on satellite imagery, in resistance reports from inside occupied territory, and, most tellingly, in Russia's own behavior on its supply routes. The weapon that made all of this possible was not a Western missile. It was a Ukrainian-designed and Ukrainian-built drone called the Firepoint FP2. Forbes defense analyst David Hambling, writing on July 3, 2026, described the FP2 as carrying a 350-pound warhead with first-person view guidance, a system capable of being flown with extraordinary precision directly into the concrete support columns of a bridge. Not in one massive single strike, but in a patient, methodical sequence. Chip away one support, chip away another, let the cumulative structural damage do the work. This tactic, which analysts have described as the bit-by-bit strategy, was something no one anticipated at scale before 2026. Hambling reported that the double road bridge at Khrenitny and Donetsk was attacked by multiple FP2 drones in exactly this fashion, successively targeting supports until both roadways collapsed. Firepoint, the company behind the weapon, announced it plans to produce over 100,000 FP1 and FP2 drones in 2026 alone, a production figure that, according to aerospace analysts, would likely outpace Russia's own Shahed drone manufacturing series. But the FP2 alone was not the only weapon transforming the battlefield. It is also worth understanding who is actually conducting these operations, because the organizational structure behind the logistics lockdown reveals something important about how Ukraine has evolved as a military force. The bridge destruction campaign against Crimea was not conducted by a single brigade operating on improvised initiative. According to reporting from Media Media in June 2026, the operation to cut Crimea off was organized by an entirely new institutional structure called the Center for Multi-Domain Operations Phalanx, established in spring 2026 by direct decision of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. The Phalanx Center united the 1st Separate Assault Regiment and the 475th Separate Assault Regiment Code 9, two into a coordinated multi-domain strike capacity, combining drone units from multiple branches, the Unmanned Systems Forces, Special Operations Forces, Army Corps formations, and National Guard of Ukraine, under a unified operational headquarters. This is not improvised asymmetric warfare. This is institutionalized, systematically funded, bureaucratically structured modern drone warfare, and the difference matters enormously for understanding the campaign's sustainability. It is not going to pause because one unit rotates off the line. Dr. Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute identified a second crucial weapon in the campaign, a system called the Ruta, a low-cost cruise missile, sometimes described as a missile drone, with a 500-pound warhead and AI-assisted targeting guidance. The Ruta, unlike the FP2's methodical column chipping approach, hits bridge supports with the force and precision of a traditional cruise missile at a fraction of the cost. Combined with the FP2's swarming patience, these two weapons gave Ukraine something it had never previously possessed in sufficient numbers: the reliable ability to bring down reinforced concrete bridge structures at range, repeatedly, with drones built domestically and scaled by the tens of thousands. Watling, speaking to Forbes in the same July 3rd report, assessed the campaign directly. There are a lot of bridges that have been targeted. Coming from RUSI, one of the world's premier defense think tanks, that observation carries significant weight, and that assessment was, if anything, an understatement. During June 2026 alone, according to a detailed operational summary published by Ukrinform in mid-July, Ukrainian forces conducted precision strikes on 15 bridges. 8 were railway bridges, 7 were road bridges. The attacks spanned virtually the entire occupied south, from Ichki, Rozdolne, Vladislavivka, and Voinka in Crimea, to bridges over the Korsak River in Zaporizhia Oblast, to the Kerch Strait and Chonar crossings in Kherson Oblast, to bridges over the Luhanchik and Idar rivers further east in occupied territory. According to Russian monitoring channels themselves, by the morning of June 11th, 2026, there were no intact bridges remaining at the land entrances to the Crimean Peninsula. Every road corridor between occupied Crimea and the occupied mainland had been closed or put under severe damage within a span of 4 days. Pause and consider what that actually means. Russia had spent $8 billion constructing a redundant supply network with multiple entry points. Ukraine destroyed every surface road entry to Crimea in 4 days. The human and logistical consequences were immediate and cascading. Kyiv Post reported that Russian monitoring channels recorded truck freight being rerouted onto narrow secondary roads, military convoys moving under armed soldier escort to reduce drone targeting, and vehicles backing up into long, stationary traffic jams near improvised pontoon bridges erected to replace the damaged crossings. Those traffic jams created their own problem. Rows of stationary vehicles in the open are precisely the target profile Ukraine's drone operators had been trained to exploit. RUSI's June 2026 analysis described the scene near the damaged Chongar Bridge, trucks locked in queues, sitting on exposed roads visible from above. Easy prey for drones, the analysis concluded. The measure Russia was using to adapt to the bridge strikes was itself generating new targets. Ukraine's campaign did not stop at bridges and convoys. According to the comprehensive operational summary published by Militarny on June 30th, 2026, during just the first 2 weeks of June alone, Ukrainian forces struck 6 railway fuel and lubricant trains, at least 3 locomotives, 18 electrical substations, and 18 telecommunications towers. These were not random or opportunistic strikes. They were components of a coherent, coordinated strategy to prevent not merely the movement of troops, but the movement of fuel, the single resource that every modern military operation consumes in staggering quantities. Oil refineries were hit, fuel terminals were targeted. The Kerch thermal power plant in occupied Crimea was struck in a large-scale overnight attack on June 23rd, with satellite fire detection data cited by the monitoring group, Crimean Wind confirming fires at the facility. On the night of June 21st, 2026, Ukrainian forces struck 3 vehicle ferries simultaneously near the Kerch Strait, vessels that Russia had been relying on to ship oil and military material across the water after the Kerch Bridge's rail section became too dangerous for regular military freight operations. According to Ukrainian defense intelligence officials, the strike on April 6, 2026, against the railway ferry Slavyanin had already destroyed the last remaining operational railway ferry in the Kerch Strait. There were no replacements. What emerged from all of this, taken together, was the architecture of a siege, and the story of the Rozdolne railway bridge captures that architecture in miniature. Rozdolne sits in northern Crimea. The railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal there was the kind of structure that did not attract much attention before 2026. A functional piece of infrastructure on a route Russia used every day to move heavy cargo, ammunition, and military supplies from the Russian mainland down through Crimea to the southern front. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces struck it for the first time overnight on June 18, 2026, simultaneously with a road bridge at the same location. Damage was assessed, but traffic continued in reduced form. On June 22nd, Ukrainian drones returned and hit the railway bridge again, this time causing critical structural damage that completely suspended train traffic along the section. Russian forces responded. Railway repair equipment was brought in within hours, with local resistance members inside occupied territory reporting the machinery's arrival to Ukrainian handlers. What happened next illustrates the tactical sophistication of the campaign. On the night of June 23rd, Ukrainian drones struck again, and this time they targeted the repair equipment itself, destroying the machinery before it could restore the bridge, and then struck the already damaged structure once more. Forbes described this as the double tap approach. It not only destroyed the bridge, it stripped Russia of the tools to fix it and sent a message that any replacement equipment would face the same fate. The bridge, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces confirmed on June 23rd, no longer existed. The only rail line connecting Russia's Krasnodar region with central and western Crimea had fallen silent. Russia's fallback position, the one it had built $11, $8 billion to protect, was now compromised in every dimension simultaneously. The Center for European Policy Analysis published an assessment in June 2026, observing that Russia had spent years deliberately trying to reduce its dependence on the Kerch Bridge following repeated Ukrainian strikes. The land corridor through occupied southern Ukraine had become the logistical backbone of Russian military operations in the south, precisely because the Kerch Bridge had proven too vulnerable and too politically sensitive to risk. But now, with the land corridor under sustained 24-hour drone attack and every road bridge into Crimea destroyed or closed, the Kerch Bridge, the very structure Russia had tried to phase out as the primary route, had once again become Moscow's most important remaining option. And it was an option freighted with problems. Ukraine's Navy spokesperson, Dmytro Pletenchuk, told reporters in early June 2026 that Russia could be compelled to transport dangerous military cargo via the Kerch Bridge, despite safety restrictions on hazardous materials and despite the previous structural damage the bridge had sustained. If they are truly pressed, they will eventually be forced to transport dangerous cargo via the bridge, Pletenchuk said, as quoted by the Odessa Journal. The RUSI analysis confirmed the same structural reality. No heavy-duty trucks can cross the Kerch Bridge due to weight and safety restrictions. Private logistics carriers were struggling to obtain insurance for vehicles operating anywhere in the corridor. and all 3 railway ferries across the Kerch Strait that Russia had been using to move oil and military material were now out of service. The Kerch Bridge's history adds another uncomfortable dimension for Moscow. Built at a reported construction cost of $7 billion, and inaugurated in 2018 in a ceremony where Putin personally drove the first vehicle across, the bridge was from the start both an infrastructure project and a political statement. It was the physical expression of Russia's claim that Crimea was irrevocably Russian territory. When it was partially destroyed on October 8, 2022, Putin's 70th birthday, by a truck bomb that collapsed a road section and set railway carriages on fire, killing 3 people, the damage went beyond the structural. Al Jazeera and CBS News both reported the attack as a profound humiliation for Putin, a direct challenge to the bridge's symbolic permanence. The bridge was repaired and restored to operations. Then it was struck again in July 2023, this time by Ukrainian maritime drones, repaired again. And through all of this, Russia quietly shifted its military freight logistics away from the bridge and onto the land corridor, precisely the corridor that is now under the full weight of Ukraine's logistics lockdown. A Ukraine War Analytics assessment published in February 2026 described the Kerch Bridge's strategic importance across 3 simultaneous dimensions: logistical, as the only fixed crossing between Crimea and Russia; political, as Putin's personal prestige symbol of annexation; and psychological, as the domestic proof of Crimea's integration that Russian audiences had been told was irreversible. Each bridge span that falls into the North Crimean Canal, each fuel depot that burns in Sevastopol, each ferry lying on the bottom of the Kerch Strait chips away, not just at Russia's military supply chain, but at the credibility of the entire Crimea narrative that Putin has built his political identity around. The maritime dimension of the campaign deserves its own attention. In July 2026, United 24 Media reported that Ukraine had extended its logistics disruption campaign comprehensively to the sea. Shipping in the Sea of Azov dropped by 67% overall, according to the report. Russia itself temporarily suspended passage through the Don Azov shipping canal on July 11, 2026, a vital maritime corridor that Russia closed not because of direct attack, but because of the threat environment that Ukrainian drone and naval operations had created. Firepoint, the Ukrainian drone manufacturer, posted on its Telegram channel on July 14th that Ukrainian forces had struck 5 oil tankers, 5 cargo ships, and a tugboat in a single night. The company termed the campaign a tankercide. The Kiev Post reported that military analyst Oksana Kuzan, co-founder of the Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center, described the campaign's scope to the Kiev Independent. What began as the use of drones to sever key logistical arteries in Donetsk Oblast has evolved into a much larger operation. Land, rail, sea, power, fuel, all of it under simultaneous, sustained Ukrainian pressure. And the effects on life inside occupied Crimea were becoming visible to ordinary people. By late June and early July 2026, reports from occupied Crimea described fuel shortages spreading to the civilian population. Sevastopol, the peninsula's largest city and the home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, began rationing gasoline using a QR code system, according to Battle Policy and Kiev Independent. Power outages hit multiple Crimean settlements: Yevpatoria, Saki, Jankoy, Krasnoperekopsk, following Ukrainian drone strikes on electrical infrastructure. Russian-installed authorities attempted to attribute the power disruptions to technical faults, but the Crimean Wind Monitoring Group and Supernova Plus both documented the explosions and fires that preceded those outages in real time. The scale of Ukraine's overall vehicle destruction campaign in 2026 provides additional context for how much the situation has changed. A Kiev Post analysis in June 2026 noted that Ukraine's General Staff daily reports showed Ukrainian forces destroyed nearly 72,000 Russian vehicles and fuel tanks between 2022 and early 2026. The breakdown is stark: 4,704 in 2022, 6,606 in 2023, 2,185 in 2024, and 39,502 in 2025. By June 2026, the projected annual figure for 2026 alone was $74,500. More than the grand total for the entire previous 4 years of full-scale war. What was happening was not a temporary surge. It was a compounding acceleration driven by drone numbers, drone capability, and the degradation of Russian air defenses that had previously offered some protection to logistics convoys. Robert Madiar Brovdi, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, gave the definitive operational summary on June 8, 2026. Military cargo traffic on Russia's primary supply highway, the E-58, designated by Moscow as the R-280 to Novorossiya highway, the very road Russia had built as a central spine of its occupied territory logistics, had dropped 71% over the previous 2 weeks, from approximately 3,800 vehicles per day down to roughly 100. Russia's own military command had officially banned military cargo on that section of highway, Pravda announced publicly, forcing convoys onto alternative routes that were slower, more exposed, and increasingly watched by Ukrainian drone operators. An official admission of their own helplessness, Pravda wrote. The concession has been noted. To be fair, and Pravda acknowledged this, a 71% reduction is not a complete halt. Around 500 vehicles per day were still moving. Russia's military has shown throughout this conflict a capacity to sustain operations under conditions that would paralyze most conventional armies. The land corridor was not severed. The Kerch Bridge still stood. Some maritime routes remained available. A June 2026 analysis published by the Lviv Herald was careful to state, Russia still retains substantial logistical advantages. The Kerch Bridge remains operational. Maritime supply routes across the Black Sea remain available, albeit under greater threat than before. These are important qualifications. Russia has adapted before. Russian commanders have improvised supply chains under artillery fire, drone attack, and sanctions pressure throughout this war. But a 71% reduction in primary route traffic, enforced by Russia's own commanders, is not a minor setback. Modern military operations at scale require continuous resupply of fuel, ammunition, and food. When the flow drops by nearly 3/4, frontline units feel it in hours. Maintenance cycles collapse. Vehicle availability drops. Offensive tempo slows. Ukrinform's mid-July analysis concluded that the logistics lockdown campaign was already breaking Russia's offensive momentum across the southern theater, not through direct combat losses, but through the accumulating pressure of degraded supply frequency and intensity. For context on what this means geopolitically, it is worth recalling how the situation came to exist. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the peninsula was essentially dependent on mainland Ukraine for water, electricity, and most goods. Putin's first major infrastructure response was the Kerch Bridge, that $7 billion engineering statement that Crimea belonged to Russia and Russia could supply it. But the bridge proved strategically fragile, so Russia built the land corridor. Then Ukraine began hitting the land corridor. So Russia built the Azov Ring and diversified routes. Then Ukraine developed the drones to hit all of them simultaneously. The $8 billion Russia spent between 2024 and 2026 building redundant logistics was, in effect, an investment Ukraine's logistics lockdown campaign is now systematically dismantling route by route, bridge by bridge, ferry by ferry. Military analysts outside Ukraine are paying close attention to what this represents as a model of warfare. Forbes, in its July 3, 2026 report, made an observation that extends well beyond the Ukraine-Russia war, that Ukraine is achieving the destruction of reinforced concrete military infrastructure in a theater where Russia nominally holds air superiority, and doing so with mass-produced, domestically built, relatively inexpensive drones. The Firepoint FP2 costs a fraction of the price of a Western cruise missile. The Ruda system, built with European partnership, is designed to be affordable and scalable. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, according to Militarny, contracted for 5 times as many medium-range drones in the first months of 2026 as in the entire year of 2025. OSINT analysts had independently counted more than 1,000 documented strikes by such drones during the spring of 2026 alone. Dr. Watling of RUSI confirmed that Russian air defenses had been severely eroded, with reported shortages of interceptor missiles and some air defense systems being pulled back to protect Moscow itself, rather than frontline logistics routes in the south. What is happening in and around Crimea is, in a meaningful sense, a real-time stress test of a theory that military planners have debated for decades, whether cheap, proliferating, AI-assisted unmanned systems can degrade the logistics of a major military power to the point of operational paralysis, without a single infantry soldier advancing into defended territory. The preliminary answer, based on what has happened since April 2026, is possibly yes, given enough production scale and operational patience. For Putin, the strategic and political implications converge uncomfortably. He called Crimea Russia's unsinkable aircraft carrier at a ceremony on Red Square in 2024. The annexation in 2014 was the defining act of his foreign policy legacy. The Kerch Bridge was his personal symbol of that claim. And now the peninsula that bridge was built to supply is reporting fuel shortages in its largest city, power outages across multiple towns, destroyed railway infrastructure, and supply traffic running at less than a third of normal capacity. None of that represents Crimea's liberation, but it represents something Putin arguably fears almost as much. Evidence that the claim of irreversible integration is, in practice, hollow, that Russia cannot reliably supply its own territory, that the unsinkable aircraft carrier is taking on water, and that the Kerch Bridge, damaged twice and politically loaded, may once again become the peninsula's last functioning lifeline. There's another dimension to this story that gets less attention than the tactical details of which bridge fell on which night: the effect on Russian domestic political perceptions. Since 2014, the Kremlin has sustained an enormous propaganda investment in the idea that Crimea is not occupied Ukrainian territory, but rather liberated Russian land, that the people of Crimea are Russians who returned home, that the annexation corrected a historical injustice, and that Crimea will remain Russian forever. That narrative requires, at minimum, that Crimea functions, that its residents have electricity, that its cities have fuel, that the peninsula does not visibly resemble a territory under siege. When Sevastopol begins rationing gasoline with QR codes, and power cuts sweep through Yevpatoria and Jankoy, and Russian families on the peninsula cannot buy fuel freely, those facts do not fit neatly into the propaganda framework. They cannot be hidden entirely in the era of Telegram, where Russian citizens inside Crimea post about shortages in real time. The Kremlin can manage the narrative in state media. It cannot fully erase the lived experience of people inside Crimea, who increasingly feel the consequences of a war they were told was won in 2022. This is not a minor political irritant for Putin. It is a slow-motion erosion of the domestic credibility of his central foreign policy achievement. The diplomatic dimension matters too. Ukraine War Analytics noted in February 2026 that any ceasefire scenario leaving Crimea under Russian control, but with Ukrainian long-range drone and missile capability intact, would leave the peninsula permanently vulnerable. Russian demands in any negotiation for demilitarization of Ukrainian strike systems are at least partly driven by the existential desire to remove this threat permanently. And Ukraine's ability to demonstrate, in real time, with satellite imagery and resistance reports and crashed drone footage, that it can sustain a logistics siege of Crimea using domestically produced weapons, gives Kiev significant leverage in any diplomatic process. A brief and honest note on sources and transparency before we close. The core factual claims in this script rest on official Ukrainian military statements, including public announcements by Commander Robert Madyar-Brovdy of the Unmanned Systems Forces, and official communiques from Ukraine's Special Operations Forces. Institutional analysis draws from RUSI, CPA, and Ukraine War Analytics. Reporting comes from multiple major outlets: Forbes, Kiev Independent, Kiev Post, Euronews, United 24 Media, Ukrinform, and the Odessa Journal. The Reuters figure of $11. $8 billion in Russian infrastructure spending is from a March 2026 report. Some details remain genuinely contested. The precise number of drones used in specific strikes is disputed. Discrepancies exist between Ukrainian military announcements and statements from weapons designers at Firepoint itself. The fuel rationing in Sevastopol, reported across multiple Ukrainian sources, had not been independently confirmed by major Western wire services as of the time this script was prepared. And the actual operational impact on frontline Russian unit readiness, how deeply the logistics degradation has reached into combat effectiveness, remains genuinely difficult to assess from open sources alone. Where contested or unverified, this script has noted it rather than smoothing it over. What is not contested, the railway bridge at Rozdolne in occupied Crimea has been structurally destroyed. The Novorossiya highway is operating at roughly 29% of its pre-campaign capacity by Russia's own behavioral evidence. Every Kerch Strait railway ferry is out of service. Sea of Azov shipping has dropped 67%. Fuel shortages are being reported in Sevastopol. Every road bridge at Crimea's land entrances was simultaneously damaged or closed for the first time in this war. And Firepoint has announced plans to more than double its drone production in the coming months. So here's the genuine question this situation raises, and it is one worth thinking carefully about. Russia has survived catastrophic logistics pressure before and kept fighting. Its military has an institutional culture of enduring hardship that should not be underestimated. But there is a meaningful difference between enduring hardship and sustaining large-scale offensive operations in a theater where your primary supply highway is running at 29% capacity, your railway arteries are being destroyed faster than you can repair them, your ferries are sunk, and the enemy's production capacity for the weapons doing all of this is accelerating. At what point does degraded logistics become operationally decisive? Not just painful, but war-altering? And if Crimea does eventually become genuinely unsustainable to supply by the accumulated weight of Ukrainian drone strikes, what does Vladimir Putin do then? Does he negotiate from a position he has spent 12 years telling Russians is non-negotiable? Or does he double down in ways that carry their own unpredictable risks? That is not a question with a clean answer today. But it is the question that makes everything happening in and around Crimea in the summer of 2026 worth watching very closely. What do you think? Can Ukraine sustain the siege long enough to force a strategic shift? Or will Russia find the adaptation it needs to stabilize its southern supply lines? Share your analysis below. The most grounded assessments of this situation come from people willing to look at both sides of the evidence. And on that note, stay informed, stay critical, and we will see you in the next one.